Earlier today, we had another service here, a solemn meditation on the Holy Cross. And the centerpiece of that service is a reading of the 7 last words of Christ from the cross, interspersed with the verses of a hymn based on that theme, Jesus in thy dying woes. These 7 utterances have been gathered from the 4 Gospels and put into an order that is not difficult to reconstruct from them. But I noticed today, since I was preparing to preach on St. Matthew's Passion tonight, that none of these 7 come from that Gospel. And do you know why? None of them are in it, except for, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that one was quoted from St. Mark. In looking into this, I realized Jesus doesn't say much in Matthew's account, or Mark's either. He prays, he talks to his disciples, he answers 2 direct questions, one from Caiaphas and one from Pilate, and that's it. If we had done a dramatic reading in parts tonight, whoever was doing the part of Jesus wouldn't have had much to do. After he's arrested, he doesn't say anything. Not much, just a lot of Jesus remains silent. And that's something the narrator would say. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Saints Matthew and Mark disagree with the other evangelists. This kind of comparison just reminds us what common sense has already told us, namely that the Gospels cannot be blow-by-blow accounts of what happened. They are highly selective. Nor is it only common sense that's told us this, but St. John in the final chapter of his Gospel. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. It is possible that Jesus actually spoke more than 7 times from the cross, but none of the evangelists preserved the additional words. But even if he did, and even if you collected all 7 we know about and some few we don't know about, it would still not be a very big collection. Now, of course, he was crucified at the time. Maybe he didn't have a lot of energy and breath for talking. But he hardly said anything during his trial either. In Luke and John, he says a little bit more, as also from the cross, but it's nothing like you would expect from a man who is famous for the power of his words, and who several times already had outfoxed his enemies when they tried to trap him verbally in public. If you put a man like that on trial for his life and then line up a bunch of false witnesses and weak accusations, you would expect him to tear them apart. His enemies might not pay attention to his virtuoso performance, but you would expect it. And it's not as if he had a defense attorney to speak for him. He was it. We notice this silence especially pointed out at 2 places in our reading. In each trial, there's a point where the head judge, Caiaphas the high priest in the first trial, Pilate the governor in the second trial, gets to the point where Jesus is being so unnaturally quiet in the face of horrible things being said about him. He can't believe it. And he says to him, in effect, say something, won't you? In the first trial, the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish religious leaders, is trying to find an accusation that will stick. They know they want Jesus dead. They've already schemed to that end. That's why they have seized him in the middle of the night. And it's why they're holding a trial in the middle of the night against their own laws. A capital trial at that, even though according to their laws also, sentence of death was not allowed to be pronounced on the same day as the evidence was heard. There's no time for that. There's no time to try him in the morning. He's supposed to be at Pilate's then. We're working on a very tight schedule here. He's got to be dead by nightfall tomorrow, or else we could have a riot on our hands, and all this would be for nothing. They are expediting the stuffing out of this trial. But because they've had to act so quickly and strike when the opportunity presented itself to get Jesus quietly into custody, they haven't had time to deal with all the little details, and they're running into some unexpected difficulties. The chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. And that seems really strange to us. How hard is it to come up with false testimony that will satisfy a kangaroo court? But Jesus had an advantage here. Or at least if he had been trying to get free, it would have been an advantage. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were not willing to see themselves as a kangaroo court. Although they had already agreed that the end goal of the whole exercise was to kill Jesus, although they were dispensing with many of their rules because of time pressure, they were still trying to adhere to the one of those rules that came explicitly from the law of Moses, the part about a trial being decided by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And the witnesses they'd been able to round up at short notice hadn't had time to get their stories straight. St. Mark explains, many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Even when 2 different witnesses testified that Jesus had claimed the power to destroy the temple and then rebuild it in 3 days, still, Mark says, yet even about this their testimony did not agree. And we say, well, come on. You're the bad guys. You've already got this judicial system of yours bent double under the extra weight you're applying to one side of the balance. Just ask some leading questions, or give the witnesses some extra time to confer, or do some hand-waving and say, minor disagreements does not impact the essence of the testimony. But they're not willing to see themselves as the bad guys. They are upright men, sons of the prophets, the solemn fathers and protectors of the people of God. They invite us to take our democratic impertinence and our modern cynicism to hell with us. Thank you very much. Even more important to them than seeing Jesus dead is continuing to see themselves as the good guys, the righteous defenders of God's law doing what has to be done. Now, come next morning in Pilate's court, they're not going to be so picky. When Pilate tries to get Jesus to talk, he says, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" Which is a far cry from the night before, where they were scraping for one admissible accusation. Apparently, when they decided that a witness's testimony wasn't believable enough, they didn't send him home. They said, "Wait over there, we can still use you in the morning." Because Pilate's court was just a formality to them, just an annoying obstacle. That dog of a Gentile governor was standing in the way of justice as they, the leaders of the people of God, had determined it. They didn't care who they put on the stand before Pilate, or what those worthless fellows would say, or if any of it was even plausible. They were just going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And if nothing sticks, we threaten to riot. That's good enough for Pilate's court. That's not good enough for the real court. That's not good enough for us, the priests of God and the defenders of his law, the righteous men. We have a higher standard. We have a sacred responsibility. It must have been frustrating being so righteous when time was running out on the only chance they were likely to get to put this troublemaker in the ground before he caused some major trouble. It began to look as if Jesus wouldn't even have to say anything clever or do any Perry Mason tricks. Figure out how to pit one faction of the council against the other, the way St. Paul did later on when he was tried by the same body. It began to look as if all he really had to do was stay silent. Let his enemies trip over themselves and their own bizarre fusion of judicial integrity and murderous intent. Then the high priest, realizing that this almost agreeing testimony about being able to destroy the temple and then rebuild it in 3 days was the best thing his witnesses had managed to come up with, and starting to get a little bit desperate, tried to gamble, talk directly to the prisoner, ask him a question, goad him into defending himself. Everyone wants to defend himself, right? And this guy, Jesus, had always been fearless. He would say anything. He had gotten away with some real whoppers. Maybe he would oblige one more time. And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And we nod. That's the smart thing to do. That's the smart play. When your enemies are tripping over their own feet, don't get in their way. So the high priest tried one more thing. I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. What does adjure mean? It means to make someone take an oath, or to command someone to do something with the same force as if they had already taken an oath to do it. It's like if you're called as a witness in a court of law, you are adjured to swear that you will say the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. But this was a weak play. Jesus still could have remained silent. It's not like they were going to send him to the cross for contempt of court, for refusing to give them exactly the admission that they felt they needed to kill him. So why doesn't he remain silent? Well, he wasn't actually seeking acquittal, was he? His silence was not a stratagem, although it might have looked like one. And it wouldn't be a stratagem the next morning either, even though, again, with Pilate and the kitchen sink approach of the Sanhedrin not working too well for him, and him knowing that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up, it could have worked again. But the silence was not strategy. The silence was simple submission to the will of God. He was not trying to save himself. The extent to which he allowed himself to try was in the Garden of Gethsemane at the beginning of our Passion reading. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And having put that plea in, registered his heart's desire 3 times, he went about business exactly as he had before. He did not interfere with the mob sent to arrest him. He did not insist on 12 legions of angels to come and bail him out. He did not mount a defense. And when the high priest adjured him in the name of the living God to answer the question that the living God had sent him to earth to answer, he answered it. And he answered it fully. No bare yes or no. He gave Caiaphas everything he was fishing for and then some. You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. That's his lawyer, if he had a lawyer. But he simply did what his Father had sent him to do. He trusted his Father to sort out the consequences. The prophet Isaiah had predicted of Christ, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. There was one righteous man on the scene when Jesus was tried by the Sanhedrin, inside or outside the building. And that one righteous man was the only one who wasn't protesting his righteousness. The priests and the Pharisees were protesting their righteousness by their willingness to endanger their whole scheme just to follow scrupulous rules of evidence according to the law. And after the fact, they could boast, hey, we obviously made the right choice. God rewarded our upright adherence to principle by causing the prisoner to volunteer a confession. And while they were doing that, Peter was out in the courtyard protesting his righteousness to the servants of the high priest, trying to convince them with many words that he was not one of Jesus' disciples. But Peter knew he was lying. And in his effort to justify himself before them, he was condemning himself before God and before his own conscience. Only Jesus was putting everything in the Father's hands. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And what was that will? The prophet Isaiah again had revealed it long before. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Jesus was silent because you curse your brothers and sisters. Jesus was silent because you speak lightly and doubtfully about the things of God. Jesus was silent because you work overtime to justify yourselves, even in the middle of your most indefensible transgressions. Jesus was silent because you also try to justify yourselves with those who do not fear God, and in so trying, betray him and yourselves. Jesus was silent because if he had justified himself, he would have talked circles around these poor human courts and walked free, as he deserved. And all the rest of us, who might be able to repeat that feat before human courts, but could never do it before God's tribunal, would have been condemned to death and hell as we deserve. And the Father's will would not have been done. Jesus, we bless you for your silence, for your deepest humility, you who came from the highest places, for your agony and sorrow. We adore you, O Lord, and we praise and glorify your holy resurrection. For behold, by the wood of the cross, joy has come into all the world. In the name of Jesus, amen.